We're back, and we're here with Brandon Sanderson. Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for stopping by. You're here during the American Library Association convention, and we appreciate you taking time in your busy schedule to talk to us. And let's get right down to text. The Way of Kings is the first novel in a new world you are building, in a world that will be known forever after as the Stormlight Archive.
Yep.
And it comes on the heels of the release of the first of the Wheel of Time novels that you are completing after the sad death of Robert Jordan, which was The Gathering Storm. And about your work on The Gathering Storm and The Wheel of Time. You have been a successful author. You've written a number of very well-received novels. You've built 3 previous series, 3 previous worlds, plus a children's series that you're doing. And yet, when this opportunity came up, you agreed to be the one responsible for completing a story that's been going on for almost 20 years. What were you thinking?
I wasn't thinking much when I first got the call. A lot of people assumed that I was friends with Robert Jordan or that he was aware of me or something like this. That's actually not how it happened. The first I heard about this was when Harriet McDougall, Robert Jordan's widow, called me on the phone one morning, unexpectedly out of the blue, and asked me if I was interested. She had heard about me through Tor, and because of something I'd written about Robert Jordan on my website, I'd written a eulogy for him. It was completely unanticipated for me. I hadn't applied for this or, called up my agent and said, hey, no, none of that happened. I was just a big fan of the books. I read Eye of the World, the first Wheel of Time book, in 1990 when it was first released in paperback. I was 14 years old. And I'd been reading them ever since. Robert Jordan's books were essentially one of these just pillars of my foundational life as a fantasy reader and as an aspiring writer, and had been following the series for a long, long time. So what was I thinking? On one hand, as a big fan of the series for so long, it was an amazing opportunity. It's the sort of thing that just doesn't happen to people. It's like winning the lottery. But when you didn't even buy a lottery ticket. On the other hand, it was really, really frightening. Here's one of the greatest writers of our time, my favorite fantasy novelist, and I'm supposed to somehow step in and try and fill those shoes and complete the series. It was very, very frightening. I almost turned it down, to be honest, because it was so daunting. I don't believe the book is as good as if he had been here to write it, because by definition, it is his book. But at the same time, what I realized that night after talking to Harriet and thinking it over was that as a big fan of the series and as a writer myself, I realized that if I didn't say yes and take hold of it myself, I didn't know who they were going to give it to. And if someone else came along and screwed it up, then it would be partially my fault. So I decided that of all the people out there, I was the one least likely to screw it up, or I would screw it up the least. And so I wrote an email to Harriet the next day, and I said, I've decided I really want to do this, because it's that whole, if Robert Jordan can't be there, I wanted to do it myself to make sure it turned out right.
Let's talk about it. You have a developed process as a writer. You've been writing for a very long time. You wrote novels before you sold your first novel. You said your first novel was actually your 6th.
That's right, yeah.
So you literally, first of all, you had to reread everything. Then you had to look at the voluminous notes, and he was famous for the massive documentation.
3 million words of notes.
And then you had to, if I remember correctly, reading an interview you gave once, you had to find out where the holes were, figure out how to fill in those holes. How did that disrupt an already well-established creative process of writing for you?
It was a very different process. I'd never done anything like this before. I had never worked in someone else's world. I hadn't ever really intended to. Wheel of Time was one of the very few of these type of projects I would have said yes to. One nice thing about it is that I was given a great deal of freedom. Harriet was still mourning when this happened. Robert Jordan, if you haven't heard the story, he asked her before he passed away to find someone. She was his editor. She's a fantastic editor, one of the founding editors at Tor Books. She's edited Ender's Game and lots of fantastic novels before she even met Robert Jordan, whom she discovered and then published and then married, in that order. And so he asked her, but she considered it a dying request. She found someone, she found me, by reading my books, by what she'd heard, and then essentially turned it over to me and said, I am an editor. My job is to make good stuff excellent. Your job as a writer is to do all of the work so that then I can look at it and decide what needs to be fixed, changed, thrown away, or added. And so I was just handed all of these notes. And when I say notes, people don't really understand what we're getting. Number one, there's 3 million words of world building and notes on characters and things like this. On top of that, Robert Jordan had written complete pieces himself, which you've been talking about. Chapters, scenes. He didn't write linearly.
No.
He wrote where he felt it was important at the time, and because he knew his time was short, a lot of where he felt it was important was the ending. That he'd promised people he had known for years and years. So he spent a lot of time writing the last scenes of the book, and he then also wrote a bunch of the first scenes. And I talk about it as one book, though it's been split into 3.
Right.
So he wrote a bunch of the first scenes to give a place to start, and then he wrote the ending, and then there are kind of landmark places in between where he'd write things or he'd leave notes. And so they handed me all of that, but they also had huge piles of dictations that while he was sick and in bed, his assistants or Harriet would come and talk to him about the book, and he would start dictating scenes, or he would start talking about scenes that need to be happened. But he wouldn't tell us what order they were to be in. He would just say, here's a scene, or this will happen with this person, or they'd say, this character, what's going to happen to this? Oh, let me tell you what happens to them. And so that was all added up. And then all the things that the assistants and the assistants are Maria and Alan, wonderful people and valuable. They and Harriet, after Robert Jordan passed away, thought of everything they could think of that he'd ever said, mentioned, or talked about maybe doing, and wrote all of that up. And this all got handed to me in a big stack. And it essentially is like someone took this beautiful vase and smashed it all up, shook it up in a bag, and said, okay, we really need you to put this back together. And there are pieces missing, and you're going to have to make those pieces look like they should have originally. And that was what my job was with this book. So it did disrupt my process, but at the same time, I'm an outliner. I spend a lot of time on my outlines ahead of time. I plan my books, and I tend to outline based around focal scenes.
Right.
I'll get a powerful, important scene I need to write, and I'll outline that and say, okay, what do I need to do to get there?
Yes.
And then it's kind of like the points on a map method of storytelling. I know I'm going to go here, zigzag, things like that.
So what he left you was something you could work with.
Exactly. He left me all of these points on the map, which I built an outline out of that is actually very similar to my own process. I always know what my ending is before I start. I have to. And he had written that ending, and he'd left me these points. And so I essentially just took his points and built an outline from that in my normal process, filling in holes where I felt they needed to be, or plugging in scenes that he had written or talked about where I felt that they would work in that.
Work in the narrative flow.
Yeah, it was surprisingly easy to build that outline, having never done this before.
But still a tremendous responsibility. And you've still got 2 more books coming out.
Yes.
We have The Towers of Midnight.
Yep.
And then we have Memories of Light.
Yes.
Which will be the conclusion.
Right.
And that, now both of those have essentially been complete. I mean, not the final drafts, but
Right.
basically you've turned in the manuscript
Towers
for both.
of Midnight I've turned in. A Memory of Light I haven't.
Yes.
But that's the one that Robert Jordan worked on the most before he passed away. So, yeah.
Okay, well now let's get back to something else. Let's get back to the 4th world you've built.
Okay.
Which is the Stormlight Archive.
Stormlight Archive.
The Stormlight Archive, which is scheduled to be a 10-book storyline.
Yes. I write compulsively. A lot of writers are like that. We just do it. We write.
It's a good thing. Trust
Yeah.
us. I'm a reader. We like that.
Yeah. And I'm a pretty young guy. Now, Robert Jordan was about my age when he started The Wheel of Time, so perhaps that won't hold as much as I think it will, but I am planning to do 1 a year, except for next year, which I will be focusing on The Wheel of Time and getting that done. The Stormlight Archive. Way of Kings has an interesting story. You mentioned the books I wrote before I got published. I actually wrote 13 novels before I got published. I sold number 6 first, which was Elantris,
Right.
a standalone epic fantasy. When I turned in Elantris, they said, well, we would like to do a 2-book contract. Do you want to do a sequel? And I said, well, you know, I really like the idea of releasing a standalone epic fantasy. It doesn't happen very often in the genre. And this feels like, you know, a good place for Elantris to be, at least for now. I'd rather do something else. And they said, okay, what else do you have? Well, I sent them this book that was the 13th I'd written. Now, this book has an interesting history. I spent a long time as an unpublished writer. And that can get kind of frustrating.
Oh, yes.
You write all of these books and you feel like you're making no progress. And I had hit a point after writing Elantris, which was my 6th book, about book number 9. I was working on, unpublished again. And this was, I felt like I was not getting anywhere. I was spinning my wheels. The books I was sending in were getting rejected. Editors were saying these are too long, you know, these are too ambitious. And so I essentially sat down after book number 9 and said, okay, I want to write, I'm going to try and write what editors will want. Terrible idea, all right? All aspiring writers out there, listen to me, don't ever do that. But I decided that I would say, okay, no one's buying this stuff that I'm writing. Nobody wants to read it, apparently, so I'll find out what people like to write or read, and I'll go write that. I'll go try and anticipate what the editors would want. So rather than writing what was in my heart, I wrote 2 books then, which were me trying to write to the market.
Right.
They were dreadful. They were absolutely horrible. They are the 2 worst books of my career. This was book 11 and book 12 that I tried to write unpublished. And wow, it was a really heartbreaking experience for me to get done with these books and to just hate them. I actually didn't send them out places. I realized I had ruined these great ideas that I'd had by trying to force them into a box of what I felt would be published.
You basically walked away from your process.
Yes, I did. And I walked away from what I should be doing, what my heart was telling me to do, and tried to just, you know, follow the points, you know, the talking points of how to write a fantasy novel. I got done with those and I said, this was a terrible idea. I will never do this again. In fact, that's when I sat down and said, I am going to throw away all advice I've been given, any sort of market following and expectations I have, and I'm just going to now write the biggest, baddest epic fantasy that no one will ever want to publish because it will be way too big, it'll be breaking all the rules, and I spent the next 18 months of my life doing that, only for me, you know, never thinking, because I was doing 10 times worse than I had been before that people had been rejecting, and that was a book called The Way of Kings. And it turned out to be, you know, this 400,000 word, and if you don't know word counts, you know, average novels are around 80 or 90. The biggest Wheel of Time book is 393, so it was longer than the biggest Wheel of Time book. Epic fantasy with this, you know, dozens of different types of magic, you know, 4,000 years of history, all of this stuff into this just awesome yet frightening book.
Which is what we're reading now after you did 3 other series. And I want to talk about this specifically because there are a couple of interesting things you said about this. First of all, that first one you wrote.
Yeah.
When you wrote The Way of Kings, when you first told the story of one young man,
Yeah.
he chose the right path.
Right.
And it was wrong for him to choose the right path when
was.
you went to read it again. And so you had to send him on another path when you rewrote.
Well, yeah, I sent Way of Kings into my editor along with Elantris, and he got back to me and said, you know, we'll do this if you really want to, but I don't think it's right for you right now. Number one, it was way too big for my career at that point. It was way too ambitious, but there were things about it that were awesome, and there were things about it that had not turned out right. And so I was very happy to say, okay, we'll shelve that for now and go work on Mistborn, which is what I did next. Probably what I'm best known for on my own is the Mistborn series. The Way of Kings sat there and just stewed in my brain for years and years and years as I thought about what went wrong, what would I do if I were going to write this book again. And one of the things that is what you mentioned. I have a protagonist who, in the original draft, made a decision. And it was the right decision. I can't really tell you too many specifics without giving away the book. By the time you read the book, you'll know. And it was the wrong decision for the book. And so when I sat down and started planning it again over these years, I thought, you know what? What if he had made the opposite decision? Which completely reconstructed the book for me in my head. but it sent this character on a path of self-discovery, which was far more useful and important to him. And it made the book work. That was one of the main things I had to change.
Now, you are known for basically creating different magical worlds with different rules in each of those worlds. And yet, people have been discussing this. There is a connection between these worlds, between the Mistborn and the Warbreaker world, where the magic is breath-based. And now you've got this new world in the Way of Kings, which is basically around shard bearers and shard blades, a different kind of magic, a different kind of power. And yet, I have read on some internet sites that there is a relationship between these worlds that you've created in terms of the universe they occupy.
You've been doing your research.
Yes, sir, I have.
This is mostly an Easter egg. It's not something that readers ever really need to know.
Right.
It's several things you mentioned there I could talk about. One is the new magics. I really love looking at magic in a scientific way, if that's at all possible. It's one of the driving forces behind me writing fantasy, is this idea of what if there were these new branches of physics that are different from what we have here, and how would people approach them? How would they look at the science of them? How would they look at the mythology or the superstition of them if it really were possible to do these things? And so I like to write rule-based scientific magic systems.
And we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to break you off there. But I do know that, for example, in this one, we're talking about a society that, after having lost the knowledge, is actually beginning to understand and perhaps gain more control over the magics and the powers that they're exercising than would have been thought possible before.
Yeah, it's about kind of a magical renaissance or magical age of discovery and reason happening in a world like this.
Well, then we will all have to become Renaissance men and women as we follow the stories in the Starlight Archive, starting with The Way of Kings. Brandon, thank you again for being here. Thank you for pouring so much of yourself into your work, because it just means there's that much more for us to enjoy.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for this edition of Fast Forward. We hope you found something of interest. We hope you come see us again. Until then, this is Tom Schad saying, take care.